All right, so here we're going to look at agility. We've obviously covered agility before in previous classes. Again, looking to give some different takes and maybe kind of hit on some just some different aspects of it, and we'll certainly look to build and even review on some concepts that we've discussed previously regarding agility. Okay, so in looking at agility, again, first of all, what we have to understand is in most team sports, and we've talked about this when we reference speed, most team sports, athletes either don't really reach top speed or they reach it very infrequently. So we know that, typically in most team sports, there's not a whole lot of running in a straight line that happens. Again, it's still a skill they have to have, but it's not something that happens a lot. So the ability to stop, start, cut, all these various things that we look at gets to be really relevant. And again, particularly when we look at just being able to change directions, both planned and unplanned. And that's part of the key with a lot of this, is to understand that you have to be able to, not just have the physical ability to change direction, but you have to be able to react to things as well. So when we look at, as we're looking at agility, so we look at change of direction ability. So these are some concepts that we've kind of talked about in the past. So change of direction ability just looks at, being able to physically change direction and be very efficient at it. Okay, so it's very important to consider that. Another thing is looking at change of direction speed. So again, predetermined, these would be looking at predetermined movement solutions. So again, sidestepping, cutting, things like that. So just the ability to change direction and change of direction speed. These are things that require certain biomechanical and physical traits to be able to do it both effectively and efficiently. Maneuverability, this is another thing we've talked about, is again, it's use of certain changes in mode of positioning. So it's not really related necessarily to maximal speed. So here we're looking at various transitions, looking at being able to kind of move efficiently, maybe even in like a small space, is something that we look at with maneuverability. So this is another thing that you could, again, there's certain drills that will actually improve this. There's certain tests. So one of the things we'll be talking about is when you look at different agility tests, so not all agility tests test the same qualities. So some may look at just pure change of direction. Some may have a little bit of a maneuverability characteristic to them. So that's an important thing to look at. And probably even more importantly is looking at, with all of this, is the perceptual cognitive ability or reactive agility. So as we all know in sports, much happens in a very unplanned fashion. Athletes have to be able to react. So it's not simply just being able to, have a predetermined cut or something like that, like you see with a lot of drills, but the ability to respond and react. And an important thing to that is it may be based on tactics. So it's talked about, for instance, if you're, you're playing offense or playing defense in a game. So they talk about with offense. So with offense, you're looking at what we call an incompatible stimulus, meaning that when you're on offense, you actually want to move in the opposing direction of your opponent. Okay, so like for instance, if you're a basketball player and you have the ball, you're looking to dribble and go in a different direction, whereas defense, they call it a compatible stimulus, meaning you're trying to move in the same direction because you're trying to stop that person. So even when you look at that perceptual cognitive ability, it may be based tactically on what you're doing at the time. Or for instance, like in some sports where you maybe only play defense or only play offense, like for instance in football, if you're you're playing football, you're only playing one side of the ball, that kind of changes. If you're a defensive back versus a wide receiver, that would probably be a good thing to look at. Wide receivers, they look at an incompatible stimulus. They're looking to move in the opposite direction. They're looking to get away from somebody, whereas the defender is looking at that compatible stimulus where they're trying to basically keep up. Okay, so when we look at the forces involved, and as we say with a lot of things, we tend to neglect the ability to produce and absorb force. So producing and absorbing force is really important when we're looking at really any skill in sports as it relates to speed and whatnot, but agility, this becomes an important factor as well. So when we look at the forces with agility, one of the things we'll talk about is the plant phase. So the plant phase is when the foot comes into contact with the ground. So you're looking at a couple different forces there. You're obviously looking at the deceleration forces. So as one is kind of slowing down in the process of getting ready to change direction, you look at the actual stopping and then the actual reacceleration. So again, as we've talked about before with agility, agility is simply just decelerating, stopping and stabilizing, and reaccelerating. Okay, so those are the things we kind of examine when we look at this. The other things we look at are the kinetics and kinematics. So kinetics, if you recall from biomechanics, specifically looks at the forces that are involved. So we look at the types of muscle contraction, the actual muscles involved in what we're looking at. Obviously, when we're talking about agility, we're looking at a lot of our lower extremity musculature, but the upper body muscles are going to play a role as well, particularly in the torso. We talk about like the abdominal muscles being able to stabilize the spine is really important because that's what's going to allow the limbs to operate the way they need to. And then the kinematics just looks at movement, but irrespective of the forces. In other words, we just strictly look at what type of movements are actually taking place. Okay, so when we look at the components of agility, and this is a little chart, or I guess it's not a chart, it's just basically a figure that's in your book. So this is really important, and take some time to look at this, because what this table does is it breaks down both the cognitive and physical components of agility. And it's pretty insightful to look at this if you're kind of looking at this chart. You can see, so you look at perceptual cognitive speed. So this looks at all the different things: visual scanning, anticipation, pattern recognition, knowledge. So you should be able to look at these different qualities as this flow chart goes down and being able to categorize where these things fall. So definitely take some time to look at this and understand it. So again, we talk about the two big aspects of agility: perceptual cognitive speed and change of direction speed. Okay, so think of this as this is kind of this is the cognitive aspect. This is the ability to react, to be able to see things on the field, so on and so forth. These looks more at the physical qualities, okay? And then you see the physical qualities, they break down further and further, okay? You have the anthropometric straight line speed, which sprint speed is going to still impact change of direction speed, because obviously you have to be moving fast to start with. And then again, some of the other qualities: reactive strength, power and rate of force development, strength. And then if you look down here, I've talked about this with other classes. Again, concentric, isometric, and eccentric strength. That's why it's so important to work on all three aspects of it. Again, if you look at any stop, start, change in direction, you see all of these muscle contractions taking place. Okay, and then over here you kind of have your, if you will, your kinematics: foot placement, stride adjustment, body lean. Okay, and we'll kind of talk about and review kind of how to optimize all of that. Okay, so looking at some components as it relates to agility, look at the concept of what's called lag time first. So lag time is the delay between increased physical capacity and the ability to actualize it in improved performance. Okay, so in other words, like when you start training something, the ability to actually see that translate into performance, it's basically your lag time. And what's really important is that soft tissue adaptations are really important to consider in this, okay? And the one thing we sometimes don't realize is that sometimes the actual muscle adapts faster than other soft tissue. So, you know, your tendons, your ligaments, they don't adapt as fast to things as muscle does. Again, where you need to be aware of that is that you have to be able to build resiliency in those other tissues. So that's an important thing to look at. Okay, strength and force production, as we've talked about in the previous slide and other things, very important. So again, the amount of strength required depends on the amount of braking involved. So obviously, the deceleration component is going to involve your eccentric strength. And there are some people who, again, you know, they could be very strong concentrically. So, you know, you may see them, you know, just lifting weights and they're very strong, but their eccentric strength may be lacking. Again, eccentric strength is controlled differently within the central nervous system than concentric strength is. Okay. So, and again, body control itself is isometric. Is somebody isometrically strong? Okay. And you can see that here. So again, pay attention to all of these, and these are in your book as well. I would definitely look at these and get an understanding of this. So you can see the muscle actions involved here kind of showing, you know, here's zero velocity. So obviously negative would be eccentric, positive would be concentric. They're kind of showing you the impact of muscle actions during this. Over here, they're looking at ground reaction forces. So you can see the difference between the vertical and horizontal forces. So you see with the vertical forces, you see the big spike in the braking and deceleration. Okay, and then, you know, obviously, you're getting high forces. Those forces are then being reduced, and then they're starting back up again as you then start to reaccelerate in that opposite direction. So looking at other components, again, we talk about that perceptual cognitive speed component. Again, these are those things that are kind of broken down a little bit more on that flow chart. So that visual scanning, anticipation, recognition, knowledge of the situation, that all plays a role with that. Again, a lot of individuals are fast and may even have some good change of direction, but can they cognitively kind of sort of manipulate things within the situation, do that, and that's really important. I always talk about punt returners and kick returners in football. You could be assured that every single punt and kick returner in the NFL is very fast. The thing that kind of separates the okay, good ones and great ones is their ability to see the field and be able to react. Okay, I would say Devin Hester, if you want to YouTube Devin Hester and you could look him up. He's one of the best punt and kick returners of all time. Again, very fast, just like everybody else, but I think what was unique to him was he was able to see the field. So those perceptual cognitive, those individual perceptual cognitive traits are very important. So again, visual scanning, anticipation, and just recognition and knowledge of the situation. And then you want to look at game-specific, task-specific, okay? And again, these are a lot of times, qualities that can actually compensate for physical deficits. So even in some people that aren't maybe as fast, okay? So for instance, there's maybe even some running backs in the NFL who rush for a lot of yards and are deemed some of the better running backs, but aren't necessarily always the fastest individuals on the field. They tend to be able to have some of these game specific, task specific components that they're very good at and they can see on the field. So again, physical traits are important, but then there's also these other cognitive aspects of sport that are relevant to really be able to work on and develop in individuals. So looking at modes of directional change, again, there's another really good, I don't actually have the graphic on here, but if you look at figure 13.4 in your textbook, there's a really nice kind of breakdown of the increasing in complexity of movement. And again, I always think like it's good for you all to kind of know different ways to progress things, because I think sometimes individuals struggle with like, well, what do we start with? What do we end with? There's a nice little sort of, if you will, they call it a framework for changing physical movements, and what it does is it kind of goes through a various transition. So your different modes of travel. So again, these are typically for many parts of change of direction tests or maneuverability tests. So these are just simple things like, forward linear running, for instance, curvilinear running, backwards running, just lateral shuffling. And even with the lateral shuffling, they talk about using a, non-crossover versus with a crossover. Okay, so that's your initial part. Then you have your transitional movements, which kind of link modes of travel, and they give examples there. So like linear running with changes in speed. So jogging, sprinting, and jogging, or walking, sprinting, and jogging. Like simple things like that could kind of help with some of those transitions. So accelerating from various start positions, they give examples of that. Transitions to and from linear running. So going from linear running to lateral movements and backpedaling, okay? And then you kind of have your, what we call your cut style change of direction, or even what, typically what this is where kind of what everybody typically thinks of with agility training. So and that's why I say sometimes to just start with a lot of the things we think of our agility training, particularly like early in the season. Like, early in the season, everybody wants to do their agility training and they want to right away do like cutting and cone drills and stuff like that. Well, how about just having them run and just transition through, some of those different things, going from running in a straight line to just then lateral shuffling. That's still agility. So that's important. But your cut style, change of direction, these are the typical change of direction with maybe just a little bit stronger deceleration, which again, you don't want to do too early on. Because again, then you're basically not letting your tissues adapt. Okay, so you're sidestepping, crossover stepping, any type of cutting back, and again, they give some examples. So again, take a look at that. But this just kind of looks at just the ability to kind of progress individuals in a little bit more responsible manner, because it's going to allow them to kind of just allow tissues to adapt and just make for more long-term development over the course of, say, an off season. And then looking at the physical, both the physical and perceptual cognitive combined. So again, these are things that we want to look at. Again, we've listed these things before: visual scanning, anticipation, pattern recognition. So again, kind of know and understand the difference. The reading kind of talks about the difference between all these, but first of all, just understanding them as a cognitive thing. And this requires a little bit more than just typically what you think of with agility drills. And we'll probably talk about some examples in class, because these are probably some of the harder things to kind of program and do. But definitely this also increases the physical demand of drills. So when you start putting this in, so again, this would be something that would come later, because again, if you're going to add this sort of like external stimulus, obviously anytime you add an external stimulus to a drill like this, it makes it harder for them. You are increasing the actual physical demands, because you're basically, again, we're just going to reference the lower body, because again, people always think of the lower body just because of obviously your weight bearing when you're doing this. But when you start to add in this external stimulus, the lower body response time is going to change, because you're trying to process, for instance, obviously visually what's happening, and you have to react to that. So, this is certainly something that, once you've done kind of all the pre-programmed things, your tissues have adapted throughout the process of that, this would come much later. And the hope is that physically you've kind of just optimized the skill of change of direction, and then you can put this added stimulus on top of it. So that ends kind of part one of this, and then part two will kind of lead off with testing.